Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Treasury Select Committee's first evidence session on our inquiry into jobs, growth and productivity after the coronavirus. I'm very pleased to be joined by three witnesses this afternoon. I'm going to ask them to very briefly introduce themselves to the committee. I'll start with Bart, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Bart van Ark. I'm a professor of productivity studies at the Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester, and I'm the managing director of the Productivity Institute, which is an ESRC-funded initiative around the nation to support productivity growth in the UK.
Great, Bart. Thank you very much, and welcome to the committee. And going to Anna, please.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Anna Valero. I'm a senior policy fellow at the LSE Centre for Economic Performance and Deputy Director of the Programme on Innovation and its Diffusion, which is an ESRC-funded programme.
Great, thank you, Anna, and welcome. And finally, to Giles, please.
Good afternoon. My name's Giles Wilkes. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Government and a consultant at Flint Global. And before that, I spent 6.5 years as special advisor to Theresa May and Vince Cable in the various governments.
Giles, thank you very much, and thank you for appearing again before our committee. I'm going to start the questioning actually just to try and get a bit of background really on the evidence around productivity, and perhaps I could start, Bart, with yourself. What is the latest evidence on how the UK is doing in terms of productivity compared to other countries, other advanced economies internationally, and how have things developed for the UK both before and after the financial crisis? Can you just tell us a bit about that, please?
Absolutely, Chair, and thank you for asking the question, because it's actually a very timely question, because the picture on the UK productivity performance changed a little bit last week as the Office of National Statistics actually revised their output and productivity estimates slightly, in the sense that the productivity slowdown, which definitely has been there since the mid-2000s, still there, but perhaps not as severe as people had thought it would be. On the other hand, the uptick in productivity before the financial crisis that was visible in the earlier statistics perhaps wasn't as sharp as it was originally expected to be. It's a question of numbers, though. The picture is still there, and that is that we've seen a very significant slowdown in the growth of output per hour worked, but also in terms of total factor productivity. It's a bit more of a technical term that also takes into account investments that businesses do, for example, has slowed down very significantly. As you say, that is an international phenomenon. We've seen that across most advanced OECD economies. But there is some evidence that points in the direction that the slowdown has been a bit more serious in the case of the United Kingdom, and I think that will be a little bit more widely discussed this afternoon. What is interesting about the revision that the Office of National Statistics made last week is that they actually introduced, and forgive me for being a little bit technically for just a few seconds, they basically provided separate estimates for the price measurements of outputs and the price measurements of inputs. And you, of course, need outputs and inputs for productivity. And as a result of that, now that I have measured these prices of inputs separately, we find that the real growth in productivity perhaps also slightly better, just a touch 0.1, 0.2 percentage points better since 2008 than it used to be. It's actually more interesting to look at the underlying industry results, because we also find that the performance of productivity in manufacturing has been slightly going up, whereas in the case of the services sector, productivity has actually slowed a little bit compared to the original figure. So there's actually a little bit of a widening in the growth rate of industry, if you like, of manufacturing industry versus the services, with one big exception, and that big exception is the telecommunication services sector, which wasn't very well measured until now, which is now properly measured, taking into account the very rapid quality changes that have happened in the telecommunication sector. And we now find that productivity growth in telecom was not just 6% on year on average, but as much as 25% a year on average. And that, of course, had quite a significant impact.
That's quite a, sorry, just stop you there for a second, Bart. That's quite a change in assessment. What drove that? How did everybody get it so wrong?
The reason for that really is that so far, again, the price measure that was used to turn the output growth in pounds into a real measure that's adjusted for inflation, that originally we used as a measure for inflation, the consumer price index for telecom services, whereas what we actually should use for productivity is a producer price index that takes account of the very rapid quality changes that have been taking place in telecommunication services. So it's a methodological improvement that many countries have made. and that the UK is now rightly making as well. And therefore, it becomes a little bit more in line with what's happening in other countries.
And why is the, you say manufacturing's been doing a bit better on the productivity front generally than services? What's driven that?
The reasons for it differ sector by sector. Again, there are a few sectors actually where it has not improved. But on the whole, you can basically say that the growth rate in real inputs wasn't as rapid as what was originally estimated when you would take into account these, when you use the so-called single deflation method and not separately took account of the price measurements in the inputs. And that has had a bigger effect on the manufacturing sector and the services sector of the economy.
And for those countries, getting back to the international comparisons here, for those countries that have been doing better than us in recent times, what are the main drivers of that? And is some of that related to the level of employment that we've had in the UK and the effect that that in turn might have, relying on labour rather than technology and other inputs might be part of that story?
Yeah, I'm sure that we will come back to this discussion later on this afternoon, because it is obviously very important to what extent is this related to the sector structure of the UK economy. I know that Giles, our other witness here on the call, has views about this which are very important to share. So obviously sector share plays a little bit of a role, but I think what is most importantly here is that since the financial crisis, we have seen many companies in the UK, not necessarily sectors, but within each sector, many companies that have gone on what we sometimes call a low value creation path, which means significant growth in employment, but low productivity employment. And as a result, many sectors in the UK economy across the board have these very long tails, as we call them. So very many firms in the sector that were not close to the frontier, whereas pretty much every sector did have a couple of firms that were very close to the frontier. So these tails are relatively long in the case of the UK, partly translated into faster employment growth, but slower productivity growth in the post-financial crisis period.
And how would you see the pandemic and potentially Brexit and the change that's brought to the employment market, sort of less labour coming from the EU 27 than previously? What do you think the impact of those two, I know they're separate issues, might have on productivity for us as we look forward?
Yeah, so obviously during the pandemic, the productivity, not just the GDP numbers, but the productivity numbers even more have become very, very volatile. And we actually at the Productivity Institute doing some research on figuring out what really happened, because one big impact that happened during the crisis is that we had some sectors like hospitality, service and accommodation that pretty much shut down. And these are relatively low productivity sectors in terms of having low productivity levels. So when these sectors become smaller, the aggregate productivity number goes up, but it's just a statistical artifact. And that's really what happened. It changed from quarter to quarter because then the sectors opened up again, then they closed down again. So it's very volatile. But what we see on average is that at the aggregate level, productivity growth has slightly improved still in 2020, despite a decline of 9.8% in GDP. However, if you take out these sector shift effects that I just described, then productivity did actually decline by about 2% if you just look at within sector performance. But again, we find that more of that productivity decline was happening in the services sector, whereas actually many industry sectors have been doing reasonably well, and perhaps in some cases even better than originally because of an uptick in demand for manufactured goods during the pandemic. And again, we see that effect also in other countries. We've done some comparison with France and with the United States. We find similar pictures there, even though the productivity advance in the United States is probably significantly higher than it is in the European countries during the pandemic.
Okay, and the Brexit point, the effect that has on migrant labour, etc. What is that going to do when it feeds through further on down the line to productivity?
Yeah, so again, it's a little early to see this in the numbers, but we have seen obviously some disruptions in the beginning of this year when the Brexit arrangements were executed and implemented. But we see some bounce backs from that. We really have to see in the longer term whether the Brexit situation is actually creating a situation in which many companies who can perhaps not benefit as much from deep relationships in their supply chains with Europe, whether that would have an impact on their productivity performance. And the other factor that you're mentioning is, of course, the availability of labor. And again, it hugely depends on sectors. In some sectors, there's a very high dependence, or was a very high dependence on immigrant labor from Europe. That's particularly true in some services sectors. They definitely see challenges at this point, particularly now that the economy is opening up from COVID. So you get this interaction taking place. But again, we will have to see how this is going to settle once we go further down the line, and once COVID gets behind us, we begin to see these Brexit effects much more clearly. And a lot of them, of course, will depend on innovation, whether companies are able to better innovate and able to substitute for their original supply chains as they had them between the UK and Europe. So that's still a little bit in the works and too early to call the shots on that.
Okay, but is it possible that there's an argument that labour may become more expensive for some of these sectors because it's not readily available on tap from elsewhere outside the UK, and as a consequence of that, that might drive the balance between labour and capital in a particular direction that actually leads to better productivity overall? Or might you be thinking, well, yes, there'll be some of that effect, but it might end up being within sectors where actually they're just not set up to capitalise on improving productivity by the nature of what they do or the way they operate?
Yeah, I think you're exactly pointing at the challenge that it differs between sectors. Obviously, when there are shortage of labor, wages will go up, and that is very likely to happen. And that will give companies an incentive to automate or to advance digital transformation. The problem, however, is that the sectors where we see these bigger shortages, again, hospitality, service, accommodation, some transportation, the opportunities to drive digital transformation, to substitute low-wage labor for automation are limited. In a restaurant, you can't replace the waiter by a robot, for example. Well, you can to some extent, but it will change the experience for sure. So we definitely have challenges between sectors, but overall, of course, rising wages, as they may occur across the economy, will provide an incentive to automation, and to the extent that companies already have invested in digital transformation before and during the pandemic, the better those companies will be able to perform. But companies that have not made that investment may find it at this point perhaps even harder, because they will now have to do that automation at the time that they can't find the skilled labor to really implement those automations. So we'll see more inequality, I think, between companies that will actually benefit from this and be more productive and more successful versus companies that will actually be even more challenged than already were before the pandemic and before Brexit happened.
Okay, Bart, thank you. I'm going to go to Felicity just in a moment, but I'm aware that I've directed all my questions at you so far. Giles, Anna, is there anything you wanted to add to any of that discussion that we've just had there? Any points that you want to make? Anna, please.
Yeah, I mean, on Brexit, I would say clearly it's too early for